And what was it like training in the dungeon that's produced so many great wrestlers over the years?
Yes, well, the first time I was in Calgary, we were training at the Matt Rat's studio. They actually had a television studio, so our sessions were there. Although I did wrestle on some Stampede Wrestling shows where I basically, quite literally, just got my butt kicked by the veterans because I legitimately had very little training. And in Stampede Wrestling, it was not a rich territory. They were running consistently, but not drawing very well. It wasn't uncommon to have 40 or less people at an event. So there were times, in my earlier days, I usually wrestled for free. Eventually it worked up to 20, I think the most I ever made for Stampede Wrestling as just a wrestler was $75. But there were times I remember when they would pay certain of the veterans in change, literally change. So yeah, because of this, sometimes there'd only be 4 matches available for a show or 5 matches available for a show. So we would have to go 20 or 30 minutes, so they would just throw us in there. And a guy like me who really did not know anything about pro wrestling would be fighting this guy that's been through the dungeon or something along those lines, had been around for a while, and they would just beat on me for 20 minutes, give me some offense here or there, but they were fairly hard beatings, but I loved it. I was really happy to be in the Stampede Wrestling ring, but now I came back and I actually joined the dungeon, which that cost money. I had to save up once again, pay to do the dungeon. And then I was actually training at the Hart House and being part of Stampede's regular cards. And at that time, they had 4 Fridays a week in Calgary. They had 2 different venues in Calgary they were running, and then spot shows that they were also running on weekends. So we would wrestle a good amount. And sometimes these spot shows were really far away. Sometimes you'd be driving ridiculous distances in a snowstorm and on icy, dark roads, and literally you'd have to set up the ring, take down the ring, get your butt kicked, and drive home. And you'd be sometimes lucky if you got $20 for that. So you learned how to wrestle, and you learned how to. I wrestled a lot of Broadways, and Bruce Hart was the booker and main trainer in the dungeon.
Did Bruce train you?
Yes, yeah, it was Bruce. Bruce training me. Stu was still around at that time, but he was not very mobile, and he would just basically be pushed in his wheelchair to just sit at the door and watch. Or in the summer, they'd have the ring outside sometimes, and he would go out there and watch. Sometimes he would allow someone to put a move on them, and he would demonstrate a move, but he was in literally his last year. I pretty much finished my time there when they had to sell the house and the dungeon finished.
So Stampede was known for a very hard-hitting style, and it's not what a lot of people might be used to. What's your opinion on that style being employed on young wrestlers?
I like that style, and there was a lot of people that came into the dungeon, and people could always come for 1 or 2 day tryouts to try it out. And very few of those people came back. Of course, everyone had been tortured going in there, and with Bruce it was a little different than Stu. Stu was a pretty good amateur wrestler, knew a lot of holds, so he would submit people or put them in submissions and punish them. Bruce was not the most amateur wrestling inclined. He did know some holds that he would demonstrate from time to time, or have other wrestlers demonstrate on each other, but with him it was mostly, sometimes you'd have to take 60 chops of practice, get slapped in the face 10 times, practice. There you're learning how to fall on literally pads over cement floor, basement floor, and you're taking 60 to 100 falls every practice. So that's what I always say to people that get injured from taking bad bumps or something like this, because the way we learned it was very painful, but you had to learn how to fall properly because the mats were absolutely unforgiving. It wasn't at all like a trampoline, or very unforgiving. So you had to learn how to fall properly or you wouldn't last long. So the way that they weeded people out of the dungeon wasn't necessarily by cardio, although getting beat on by several veterans for maybe an entire practice, which could last up to 4 hours, sometimes even more than 4 hours, but on average I would say 3 hours. I mean, you'd be weeded out pretty fast, and those veterans had been put through hell, so they wanted to beat on the new people. So that's the way it was, and I'm glad I was trained that way. But you certainly had to be tough to make it through the dungeon, because you just didn't last if you weren't.
So you're known for having very hard-hitting matches. How has training there and learning how to bump properly influenced or impacted your career, basically?
The hard-hitting matches is just, that's the way I learned how to wrestle, and that's the way I like to wrestle. And learning how to fall properly, I never had a serious injury from wrestling, and I've been wrestling a long time. I started in 2001. We're now in 2016. So I've never had a bone injury or anything from wrestling other than obviously aches and pains and bruises and cuts and pain like that, but no serious injuries from not knowing how to wrestle properly.
So you mentioned the houses weren't the biggest in Stampede. What were some of the biggest houses they drew?
The biggest one they drew that I ever wrestled on there was probably 450, when that was a really big one. So those were in the definitely the dying days of Stampede Wrestling, but there were good wrestlers. Johnny Devine was there, as we mentioned, TJ, Harry, Natty, Rick, Viktor was there. A lot of great talent. So it was still a learning ground.
Was Jim Neidhart still around that time?
Jim Neidhart would do events here and there, yes. I remember him being around. He was always a comical character.
Now, what was he like? Do you have any funny stories about him?
I actually met Davey Boy Smith a few times in the locker room at Mat Rats, but he wasn't actually wrestling on those shows. He was just hanging out with his son, Harry, and Georgia, Harry's sister. But I think the first star wrestler, other than Jacques Rougeau, that I'd actually been in a dressing room with was Jim Neidhart. So I guess I'm not going to talk about the advice that he gave me, but he did give me some advice. The first star wrestler to start giving me advice, I guess, he gave that to me on an Indian reserve in Lethbridge, Alberta one night. So I guess he was the first star that kind of advised me.